Lean Startup. This video is based on key insights from the book Lean Startup by Eric Ries. Introduction. Eric Ries begins by sharing a common story, the image of bright students starting a company in their dorm room, full of energy and new ideas. He quickly connects this to his own experience, recalling the painful memory of his first startup failing despite seeming to have all the right ingredients: a good product, a talented team, and perfect timing. He vividly describes the moment he realized things were falling apart, a rainy argument with his co-founder symbolizing the company's disintegration. This wasn't a lack of hard work, he explains, but a lack of understanding how to turn a good idea into a successful business. Ries points out that failure in startups is common, yet the stories we often hear celebrate only the successes. He argues that these success stories are misleading, creating a myth that hard work and a great product automatically lead to fame and fortune. He's observed this firsthand, working with many entrepreneurs whose promising ideas ultimately didn't work out. He believes this happens because people focus too much on the exciting parts, the idea, the technology, and not enough on the boring stuff, the process of actually building a company. The author proposes a surprising idea: entrepreneurship is management. We often think of these as separate things, with entrepreneurship being cool and innovative and management being dull and serious. Ries believes this is a mistake. He shares another startup story, this time about IMVU, a company he co-founded in 2004 focused on avatars and virtual worlds. This time, however, they deliberately did things differently. Instead of perfecting the technology for years, they quickly built a basic version, full of bugs, and released it to customers. They then constantly updated the product, sometimes dozens of times a day, based on how people used it. Ries explains that this approach, while unconventional, worked. They didn't necessarily do what customers told them to do, but they used customer feedback as one piece of information in a larger process of experimentation. This method, drawing on ideas from lean manufacturing, design thinking, and agile development, became the foundation for what he calls the lean startup. He emphasizes that this isn't about luck or genius, but about following a specific process that can be learned and taught. The author's journey to this approach was a long one, stemming from his frustration with repeatedly building products that failed. He initially thought the problems were technical, but eventually realized that a new approach to management was needed. He was influenced by Steve Blank's work on customer development, which emphasized the importance of understanding the customer. Through experimentation at IMVU and studying other industries, particularly manufacturing, Ries developed the Lean Startup framework. IMVU itself became a success, with millions of avatars created and significant revenue. This success led to requests for advice from other startups, and Ries found that his experiences often met with skepticism. He began writing and speaking about his ideas, refining the lean startup theory through collaboration and feedback. His goal is to reduce waste in the startup world, the countless hours and resources spent on products nobody wants. Ries then lays out the 5 core principles of the lean startup. First, entrepreneurs aren't just people in garages. Anyone working on new products under uncertainty is an entrepreneur. Second, entrepreneurship is a form of management, requiring a specific skill set. Third, the goal isn't just to build something, but to learn how to build a sustainable business through validated learning testing assumptions scientifically. Fourth, the core activity is the build, measure, learn loop. Creating a product, measuring customer response, and then deciding whether to change course or continue. Finally, innovation accounting is crucial for tracking progress and making informed decisions. The author addresses why so many startups fail, arguing that traditional planning and market research are often ineffective in the face of uncertainty. He also cautions against the just do it approach, which relies on chaos instead of structure. He believes that startups can be managed effectively, and that a focus on process is essential for success. He concludes by framing the lean startup as a new era in management, one that empowers innovators to build successful companies and change the world. He intends this book to be a guide for anyone involved in creating and managing innovative ventures. Chapter 1, Start. Eric Ries begins by explaining that starting a business is really about building something new, and that takes careful planning or management. Many people think being an entrepreneur and being a manager are totally different, but Ries argues they actually go hand in hand. He notes that entrepreneurs often shy away from traditional management because they worry it will slow things down or kill creativity. However, simply avoiding all planning and structure can lead to chaos and failure, something Ries learned from his own early business attempts. Ries points out that while good management has helped us make a lot of things over the past century, it doesn't work well for startups. Startups are messy and unpredictable, and traditional management is built for more stable situations. He believes entrepreneurs need a special kind of management that can handle this uncertainty. He highlights a surprising trend. More people are starting businesses than ever before, partly because technology has made it easier. But even with all this effort, many startups still fail. Products flop, companies disappear quickly, and a lot of talented people waste their time and energy on ideas that don't work. This is where the lean startup approach comes in, aiming to reduce these failures. The lean startup idea comes from lean manufacturing, a system developed at Toyota. Lean manufacturing focuses on getting rid of waste, using workers' ideas, making things in smaller batches, and speeding up production. Ries adapts these ideas for startups, suggesting they measure progress differently than other businesses. Instead of just counting how many products they make, startups should focus on validated learning, proving that people actually want what they're building. This means using scientific methods to test ideas and eliminate things that aren't working. Ries emphasizes that a good startup plan needs to cover everything, from the initial idea to growing the business, finding partners, and organizing the team. It also needs a way to measure progress when things are uncertain. Entrepreneurs constantly face tough choices, like when to invest in processes or when to change direction. The lean startup aims to give them a framework for making these decisions and testing their assumptions. For example, Ries predicts that if a company tries organizing teams around learning instead of traditional departments, the teams will initially complain about being less productive. This is because people are used to measuring their work by how much they do, not how much they learn. Ries uses the example of Henry Ford and the automobile to illustrate his point. A car has two important feedback loops. The first is inside the engine, where each part works together to make the car move. The second is between the driver and the steering wheel, allowing the driver to adjust the car's direction. Startups, he argues, are similar. They have an engine of growth, everything they do to attract and keep customers, and they need a steering wheel to make adjustments. Too many startups, however, try to plan everything in advance, like launching a rocket ship. This is risky because even small mistakes can lead to big problems. Ries shares a story of a company that launched a product with a lot of fanfare, but few people actually bought it. Because they had invested so much in preparation, they couldn't adapt quickly enough and ultimately failed. The lean startup, in contrast, is about learning to drive a startup, making small adjustments based on feedback, rather than following a rigid plan. This involves a build, measure, learn loop, where entrepreneurs build a product, measure how customers respond, and then learn from the results to improve. Ries stresses that while startups need to adjust their strategies, they should always have a clear vision, a long-term goal for what they want to achieve. He describes a startup as a mix of activities: running the engine, improving the product, and steering the direction. As a company grows, the balance of these activities changes. Finally, Ries points out that failing to deliver results is often seen as a problem in traditional management. But in the world of startups, failure is often a necessary part of learning and innovation. He suggests that entrepreneurs are actually internal innovators, and that entrepreneurial management can help them succeed, which he will explore further in the next section. Chapter 2, Define. Eric Ries begins by challenging the typical idea of who an entrepreneur is. He noticed that many people attending his talks about the lean startup weren't the usual young founders, but managers from big companies tasked with innovation. These managers already knew how to navigate company politics and had a clear vision for the future, yet they felt stuck. They had all the pieces: teams, ideas, and willingness to take risks, but lacked a clear process to turn those pieces into real success. Ries uses the example of Mark, a manager at a large company who had everything in place to innovate but felt like they were missing a spark. This illustrates a common problem. Companies often focus on setting up for innovation, but not on how to actually do innovation once the team is ready. Ries emphasizes that this makes Mark an entrepreneur just as much as someone starting a company in a garage. He broadens the definition of an entrepreneur to include anyone creating something new when it's unclear if it will work. He introduces the term intrapreneur for those innovating within existing companies, but argues they face similar challenges and benefit from the same principles as traditional entrepreneurs. Essentially, Ries is saying that the need for a structured approach to innovation isn't limited to small startups. Large companies need it too. He defines a startup not by its size or industry, but by its purpose: to create a new product or service in a situation where success isn't guaranteed. He stresses that a startup is a complex, human institution. It's about people, teamwork, and building a lasting organization, not just a cool idea. To further illustrate his point, Ries shares the story of SnapTax, a mobile tax filing app developed by Intuit, a large financial software company. This is surprising because Intuit already had a successful tax software, TurboTax. The SnapTax team faced a common problem. People didn't know how to use scanners to send in their tax forms. They cleverly solved this by allowing users to simply take a picture of their forms with their phones. Customers then asked if they could complete their entire tax return on their phones, leading to a simplified and successful product. This story highlights how listening to customers and starting small can lead to big innovations, even within a large, established company. Ries points out that SnapTax's success wasn't due to hiring special, entrepreneurial people or having unlimited resources. Instead, Intuit's management created an environment where the team could experiment freely. This is a key takeaway. Innovation isn't just about having good ideas, it's about having a process to test those ideas quickly and learn from the results. He contrasts this with the traditional approach of detailed planning and long development cycles, which often leads to products that fail because they don't meet customer needs. Intuit's founder, Scott Cook, realized that the company's new product launches weren't performing well despite good management practices. He recognized the need for a new approach to innovation. Ries explains that Cook began to implement the lean startup principles throughout Intuit, encouraging teams to run many small experiments instead of one big launch. For example, the TurboTax team started testing hundreds of changes each week during tax season, allowing them to quickly identify what worked and what didn't. This shift from a political environment where people had to sell their ideas to an entrepreneurial environment where ideas were tested directly with customers was crucial. Cook understood that leadership's role wasn't to approve every idea, but to create the systems and culture that enabled teams to experiment and learn rapidly. Ries concludes by emphasizing that building an innovation factory, a company that consistently creates successful new products, requires a new kind of management, one that embraces uncertainty and prioritizes learning. He suggests that Intuit's journey demonstrates that even large, established companies can become more entrepreneurial by adopting these principles. Chapter 3: Learn. Eric Ries begins by sharing his frustration as an entrepreneur. It's hard to know if your company is actually making progress. As an engineer and manager, he was used to measuring success by sticking to plans, making quality products, and staying within budget. But he realized that if nobody wanted what you were building, it didn't matter how well you built it. He felt like he was just keeping people busy and spending money, hoping for the best. He acknowledges that learning is often used as an excuse for failure, a way for managers to explain why things didn't work out. Entrepreneurs are good at saying they've learned something, especially when their jobs depend on it. However, Ries points out that learning doesn't pay the bills or impress investors. It doesn't help employees or customers. It's easy to talk about lessons learned, but it's much harder to prove you're actually moving forward. He argues that if you're starting a business in a world full of uncertainty, learning is actually the most important thing you can do. You need to figure out what's working and what's not, what customers really want, not just what they say they want, and if your business can actually survive. This leads Ries to introduce the idea of validated learning. This isn't just about feeling good about what you've learned. It's about proving you've discovered important truths about your business. It's a careful way to show progress when everything is uncertain. Validated learning is about using real evidence to see if your ideas have a future. It's better than just guessing what the market will do or making a traditional business plan that might be wrong. It helps you avoid the biggest mistake of all, working really hard on something that nobody needs. To illustrate this, Ries shares the story of IMVU, a company he co-founded. They wanted to create a new instant messaging service, but they quickly realized things weren't going as planned. They thought they had a brilliant strategy: enter a huge market, instant messaging, and combine it with the fun of 3D games. They decided to create an add-on for existing messaging programs, so people wouldn't have to switch to a new service or convince their friends to join them. They believed this would spread quickly, like a virus. The team worked incredibly hard for 6 months to build this add-on. It was complex and rushed, and the first version wasn't very good. But they launched it anyway, fearing that delaying would be worse. However, almost nobody downloaded or used the product. Despite fixing bugs and adding features, very few people actually bought it. They set small revenue goals each month, but struggled to reach them, relying on friends and family to make small purchases. Ries explains that this is where validated learning comes in. They realized they were spending a lot of time building something nobody wanted. Instead of just assuming they were wrong about how to build it, they needed to question their entire idea. They started talking to potential customers, bringing them into the office to try the product. They discovered that people didn't want an add-on. They wanted a completely new messaging service. They didn't mind learning a new program, and they actually wanted to meet new people, not just chat with existing friends. Ries admits that it was hard to admit they were wrong, especially since he had put so much work into the original software. He felt like he had wasted his time. But he realized that the real progress wasn't about building features. It was about learning what customers actually wanted. He defines value as anything that benefits the customer, and waste as everything else. They needed to focus on learning as quickly and efficiently as possible. He emphasizes that startups need to prove their ideas with real data, not just stories or assumptions. He shares how they experimented with different versions of their website and product, measuring which ones attracted more customers. Some experiments failed, like paying customer service agents to guide new users. But each experiment taught them something valuable. Eventually, they discovered that people wanted to use IMVU to make new friends, and that insight led to success. Ries acknowledges that it's tempting to hide a lack of progress with marketing or public relations. But he argues that this is a waste of resources. What really matters is showing real progress, even if the numbers are small at first. He concludes by saying that the lean startup approach is about treating every part of a business as an experiment, constantly testing and learning to build something people actually want. It's a scientific method for building a successful business, and it can be applied to any industry. Chapter 4, Experiment. Eric Ries begins this section by pointing out a common problem for new businesses: figuring out what to build and who to listen to. Many startups jump in and just do it, hoping something will work, but this often leads to wasted time and effort. Ries argues that simply launching a product and seeing what happens isn't learning. It's just seeing what happens. He emphasizes a key idea from science: you can't learn if you can't possibly fail. If everything always goes as planned, you don't discover what doesn't work. and that's just as important as knowing what does. Rise introduces the lean startup method, which treats a startup like a series of experiments. These aren't experiments in a lab coat kind of way, but tests of the business's core ideas. Like scientists, startups should start with a clear idea, a hypothesis about what will happen. Then, they should test that idea to see if it's true. However, unlike pure science, these experiments are always guided by the overall vision for the company. The goal isn't just to find something that works, but to discover how to build a lasting business around a specific dream. To illustrate this, Rise shares the story of Zappos, the online shoe store. The founder, Nick Swinmurn, had a big vision, a fantastic online shoe shopping experience. But instead of immediately building a huge warehouse and website, he started small. He took pictures of shoes from local stores and only bought them if someone ordered them online. This was a simple experiment to test if people even wanted to buy shoes online. This initial step wasn't just about shoes. It was about learning how customers behave, what they need, and what surprises might pop up. For example, they learned about returns, which they hadn't initially planned for. Zappos proved that observing real customer behavior is much more valuable than just asking people what they think they want. Rise then turns to an example within a large company, Hewlett-Packard, HP. Caroline Barlerin wanted to get more employees to volunteer their skills for good causes. A traditional approach would involve lots of planning and getting approval from different departments. However, Rise suggests treating this like a startup experiment. Barlerin's big vision was to turn HP employees into a force for positive change. But that vision was full of assumptions. Would employees even volunteer? Would they prefer using their work skills or doing manual labor? Rise explains that the key is to break down the vision into testable parts. He introduces the concepts of the value hypothesis and the growth hypothesis. The value hypothesis asks if customers actually find the product or service useful once they use it. The growth hypothesis asks how new customers will find out about it. In Barlerin's case, a simple experiment would be to offer a great volunteer opportunity to a small group of employees who already care about giving back. Then, she could track if they continue volunteering and if they tell their colleagues about it. If the experiment fails, if no one volunteers again, that's valuable information. It means the initial assumptions were wrong, and it's time to try a different approach. Rise emphasizes that an experiment is a product. Even a simple experiment provides valuable data and allows the team to learn and improve. He contrasts this with Kodak's past approach, where they would build a product fully before testing if anyone actually wanted it. He shares a story about Kodak Gallery's failed attempt to launch decorated greeting cards, highlighting the importance of testing assumptions before investing significant resources. Kodak Gallery learned to focus on solving customer problems, not just delivering features. Finally, Rise presents the story of Village Laundry Services in India, a business that provides affordable laundry services. They started with a washing machine on a truck to test if people would actually use their service. Through a series of small experiments, they learned what customers wanted: faster service, ironing, and reliable cleaning. This led them to develop a mobile kiosk with all the necessary equipment. Rise concludes by suggesting that even government agencies can benefit from this experimental approach, using the example of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. By starting small and testing assumptions, they can avoid costly mistakes and build a more effective agency. The core message is that learning and adapting are more important than sticking to a rigid plan, especially when building something new. Chapter 5, Leap. Eric Ries begins this section by telling the story of Facebook's early days. It's a surprising tale because when Mark Zuckerberg, Dustin Moskovitz, and Chris Hughes started Facebook in 2004, it wasn't a huge hit right away. They didn't have many users, and they weren't making much money. Yet, they were able to convince investors to give them a lot of funding, first $500,000, then over $12 million. Rise explains this wasn't because of a brilliant business plan, but because investors were impressed by how much time people spent on the site and how quickly it spread across college campuses. This showed investors that people really wanted Facebook, and it was growing fast. These are two key things any new company needs to prove. Ries points out that many people criticized Facebook's early investors, thinking they were making a mistake. They thought Facebook didn't have a way to make money and was just like the dot-com bubble of the late 1990s, where companies got big quickly but didn't have real businesses. However, Facebook was different. It didn't have to pay to get customers like those old companies did. People just naturally wanted to use it, and that meant lots of attention, which advertisers would definitely pay for. The author emphasizes that many entrepreneurs try to copy Facebook's success, but they get confused about what's important. Is it about not charging customers? Is it about not spending money on advertising? Ries says these questions don't have simple answers. Every company is different. Instead, startups need to experiment to find out what works for them. Strategy, according to Ries, is about figuring out the right questions to ask, not having all the answers up front. Ries explains that every business plan starts with assumptions, things the founders believe are true. But these assumptions haven't been proven yet, and they're often wrong. So, a startup's first job is to test those assumptions as quickly as possible. Traditional business strategy helps identify what those assumptions are, but the real challenge is testing them without losing sight of the overall goal. Most assumptions seem obvious, like the idea that advertisers will pay for attention. But hidden among those are the really important ones, the leaps of faith, like believing people actually want your product. If those leaps of faith are correct, the company could be huge. If they're wrong, the company could fail. To illustrate this, Ries uses an example of a company with new technology. They argued their technology would work just like a previous one did, leading to success. But Ries points out this hides the real leap of faith. Are people actually waiting for this new technology? He argues it's better to state the leap of faith directly. We believe people want this, they can afford it, but they can't get it now. Then, the company can test that belief directly, instead of building a product and hoping people will come. Ries introduces the idea of analogs and antilogs, a framework used by venture capitalist Randy Komisar. An analog is a similar situation that worked in the past, like the Walkman, showing people would listen to music with headphones. An antilog is something that didn't work, like Napster showing people weren't willing to pay for music. These help identify the key questions a startup needs to answer. For example, with the iPod, the leap of faith was that people would pay for music. Ries cautions against thinking success is just about being in the right place at the right time. Many entrepreneurs were building cars when Henry Ford was, but most of them failed. What made Ford different was his ability to learn what was working and what wasn't, and adjust his strategy. Similarly, Facebook wasn't the first college social network, but it was the one that figured out how to grow quickly and keep people engaged. The author highlights two crucial leaps of faith: value creation and growth. Does your product actually help people? And can you get more people to use it? Ries stresses that growth isn't always good. Growing by spending a lot of money on advertising without a good product is like success theater. It looks good, but it's not real. Ries then introduces the concept of genchai jembutsu, a Japanese term from Toyota's manufacturing system. It means go and see for yourself. Toyota believes you can't understand a problem unless you experience it firsthand. He uses the example of a Toyota engineer who drove across North America to understand what minivan customers wanted. This firsthand knowledge led to improvements in the Sienna minivan and increased sales. While this works well for established companies, Ries notes that startups need to use this approach to figure out which assumptions to test, not necessarily to perfect a product already understood. Finally, Ries emphasizes the importance of talking to real customers. Numbers are important, but they represent people. He encourages entrepreneurs to get out of the building and talk to potential customers, like Scott Cook of Intuit did when he started his company. Cook simply called people and asked if they found paying bills frustrating. This simple question validated his idea and gave him the confidence to move forward. Ries also introduces the idea of a customer archetype, a detailed description of your ideal customer, which helps guide product development. He warns against getting stuck in analysis paralysis, endlessly researching and planning without actually building anything. The key is to test your assumptions quickly and learn from your mistakes. Chapter 6, Test. Eric Ries begins by illustrating how even hugely successful companies like Groupon didn't start with a grand plan. Groupon's beginning, a simple pizza coupon in Chicago, was far from revolutionary. However, it showed that the idea could work. This highlights a key idea. It's okay to start small and imperfect. Ries explains that Groupon actually began as something completely different, a platform for people to work together on causes. It wasn't until that idea didn't take off that the founders tried something simpler, leading to the group coupon concept. Ries emphasizes the importance of a minimum viable product, or MVP. Think of it like building with Legos. You don't need the entire castle to see if the basic structure is sound. The MVP is the simplest version of a product you can create to test if people actually want it. He uses Groupon's early days as an example. A basic website, manually created coupons, and a lot of scrambling to keep up with demand. It wasn't pretty, but it proved the idea had potential. Ries points out that the MVP isn't about building the smallest possible product, but the fastest way to learn if your idea is worth pursuing. The author contrasts this approach with traditional product development, where companies often spend a long time perfecting a product before showing it to anyone. Ries argues that this is risky. Instead, the MVP is about learning, not finishing. It's about testing your core beliefs about the business, not just whether the product works technically. He uses the example of IMVU, a company he was involved with, which initially had a buggy product and low revenue. However, the early growth, even if small, showed that people were finding value in what they offered. Ries stresses that early adopters, the first people to try a new product, are crucial. These are people who are willing to accept imperfections and are excited to be among the first to use something new. He compares them to people lining up for the first iPhone, even though it lacked features we now consider essential. Early adopters fill in the gaps with their imagination and are motivated by being on the cutting edge. Trying to make a product perfect for everyone before getting feedback from these early users is a waste of time and resources. He acknowledges that it's hard for entrepreneurs to accept this. They often have a vision of a polished, perfect product. But Ries argues that an incomplete product is often more valuable because it allows for faster learning. He provides a practical example, a service offering a free trial. The key question isn't about all the features, but whether people will even sign up for the trial. Every extra feature added before testing that basic question is a potential waste. Ries then shares two more examples of companies using MVPs effectively. Dropbox, the file-sharing service, didn't build its entire system before testing if people wanted it. Instead, they created a simple video demonstrating how the service would work. The video generated huge interest and a long waiting list, proving the concept without requiring a fully functional product. Food on the Table, a meal planning service, started by personally creating meal plans for just one customer. This concierge MVP allowed them to learn what customers needed before investing in building a complex system. The author explains that these MVPs aren't about providing a poor experience, but about learning quickly. He introduces the concept of Wizard of Oz testing, where the product appears automated, but humans are actually doing the work behind the scenes. This allows companies to test their ideas without building expensive technology upfront. Aardvark, later acquired by Google, used this technique to test its idea for a question-answering service. Ries addresses common concerns about building MVPs. He acknowledges that quality is important, but argues that you can't define quality until you know who your customer is and what they value. He uses the example of IMVU's initial lack of avatar movement. Customers preferred a simple teleportation feature over a more realistic, but delayed walking animation. This shows that customers don't always want what you think they want. Finally, Ries warns about potential roadblocks like legal issues, fear of competition, and branding concerns. He suggests launching MVPs under different brand names to minimize risk. He also emphasizes the importance of being prepared for negative feedback and having a plan for adapting based on what you learn. He introduces the idea of innovation accounting, a system for measuring progress and validating learning in a startup, which he will discuss further later. The core message is that building an MVP is about learning, adapting, and ultimately, building a product that people actually want. Chapter 7, Measure. Eric Ries begins by explaining that when a startup begins, it's really just an idea, a plan on paper. The financial plans show guesses about how many customers the company will get, how much it will cost to run, and how much money it will make. But these plans are often far from reality. A startup's main job, according to Ries, is to figure out where it actually is right now, even if the truth is hard to face, and then to experiment to get closer to the goals in the original plan. Most new products don't completely fail. They usually have some customers and some positive results. The biggest danger is getting stuck in a living dead state, where a company isn't really succeeding, but isn't failing quickly either. People naturally want to believe in their ideas, even when things aren't going well, and Ries warns against blindly persevering just because of stories of other entrepreneurs who overcame huge obstacles. Ries argues that accounting, often seen as boring, is actually incredibly important for startups. Traditionally, accounting has been used by big companies like General Motors to control different parts of the business and make sure everyone is meeting goals. However, standard accounting doesn't work well for startups because they are too unpredictable. He shares a story about a successful startup he met with, one that was growing quickly and doing well. Even though they were making changes to their product, they couldn't really prove those changes were making things better. They just assumed that if numbers went up, the changes were good. Ries points out that this is a common problem. It's hard to know if improvements are actually caused by the changes you make. This is where a new kind of accounting, innovation accounting, comes in. Innovation accounting helps startups show, in a clear way, that they are learning how to build a business that can last. It starts by turning the big assumptions in a business plan into numbers. Every business plan has assumptions, like how many customers a company needs to be successful. For example, a company that makes things will grow as it sells more, reinvesting profits into marketing to get even more customers. Growth depends on how profitable each customer is, how much it costs to get a new customer, and how often customers buy again. A marketplace like eBay grows differently. It depends on having lots of buyers and sellers, creating a network effect where more of one attracts more of the other. Ries emphasizes that even though these businesses are different, a common framework can be used to hold their leaders accountable. Ries breaks down innovation, accounting into 3 steps. First, a startup needs to create a minimum viable product, MVP, to get real data about where the company stands. This is the simplest version of the product that can be used to learn. Second, the startup tries to improve the product based on what it learns from the MVP. This involves making lots of small changes. Finally, the startup decides whether to pivot, change direction, or persevere, keep going. If the company is making progress toward its goals, it should continue. If not, it needs to make a big change. A successful pivot means that the improvements after the change are more effective than before. To establish a baseline, a startup might create a complete prototype and try to sell it to customers. Or it might test one assumption at a time. Before building anything, a startup can even do a smoke test, where they let customers pre-order a product that doesn't exist yet to see if there's interest. These MVPs provide the first learning milestone. Ries stresses the importance of testing the riskiest assumptions first. If a company can't overcome those risks, there's no point in testing the others. He uses the example of a media company that needs to capture people's attention and sell that attention to advertisers. Testing whether people will pay attention is the bigger risk, so that should be tested first. Once a baseline is established, the startup moves to tuning the engine. Every change to the product, marketing, or anything else should aim to improve the drivers of the growth model. For example, if a company thinks making the product easier to use will attract more customers, they should test that. But they need to prove that the changes actually improve the activation rate of new customers. Ries warns against simply making changes and hoping for the best. The final step is deciding whether to pivot or persevere. Over time, a successful startup will see its numbers improve and get closer to the goals in its business plan. If the numbers aren't moving, it's a sign that the company needs to change direction. Ries shares his experience with IMVU, a company he co-founded. They spent months improving the product, but the numbers weren't changing. They were working hard, but not seeing results. They realized they needed to talk to customers and understand why their improvements weren't working. Ries explains how they used a small daily advertising budget of $5 to get constant feedback on their changes. They tracked key metrics like customer registration, downloads, and purchases. They created a graph showing how different groups of customers behaved, called a cohort analysis. This graph showed that despite constant improvements, the percentage of customers who actually paid for the product remained the same. This helped them realize they had a problem. They needed to pivot. He contrasts vanity metrics, like total number of customers, with actionable metrics, like the percentage of customers who complete a specific action. Vanity metrics can be misleading and make a company feel like it's making progress when it's not. Actionable metrics show clear cause and effect. Ries uses the example of Grokkit, an online test preparation company, to illustrate this point. They initially focused on the wrong metrics and were making little progress. By switching to cohort analysis and split testing, they were able to identify what was really working and make better decisions. They learned that simply making the product better wasn't enough. They needed to understand what customers actually wanted. Ries concludes that the most important thing is to focus on learning and making data-driven decisions, rather than just working hard and hoping for the best. Chapter 8, Pivot or Persevere. Eric Ries dives deep into a crucial challenge for anyone building a new business: knowing when to stick with your original plan and when to completely change direction. He calls this decision point the pivot or persevere moment, and it's something every entrepreneur will face. It's not about having a rigid formula, Ries explains, but about using smart thinking and learning from what happens when you try out your ideas. He stresses that gut feelings and vision are important, but they need to be tested with real-world feedback. The biggest mistake a startup can make is stubbornly sticking to a plan that isn't working, wasting time and money in the process. Ries emphasizes that the lean startup approach isn't about churning out tons of stuff, but about making sure your efforts are focused on something people actually want. A successful pivot isn't just a random change. It's a strategic shift based on what you've learned. To illustrate this, Ries shares the story of David Binetti and his company, Votizen. Binetti wanted to make it easier for people to get involved in politics. He started with an idea for a social network for voters, but it wasn't taking off. Binetti used a smart approach called innovation accounting, which means carefully tracking key numbers to see if his idea was working. He built a simple version of his social network and launched it quickly, spending only a small amount of money. He then looked at how many people signed up and actually used the site. The numbers weren't great, so he made changes and tested again. Even after improvements, the numbers still weren't good enough. Ries points out that this is where many entrepreneurs get stuck. They see some success and convince themselves it will eventually work. Binetti, however, was willing to face the facts. Binetti had identified 4 key things that needed to happen for his idea to succeed. People needed to sign up, verify their voter status, keep using the site, and tell their friends. He found that people were signing up and verifying their status, but they weren't sticking around or spreading the word. This told him something was fundamentally wrong. He didn't give up, but he realized he needed to try something different. This is where the pivot came in. Binetti listened to his customers, who said they liked the idea of easily contacting their representatives. He shifted his focus to a new product called At2Gov, which allowed people to quickly send letters to their elected officials through social media. This was a zoom-in pivot, focusing on a single feature that customers liked. However, even this new version didn't quite hit the mark. People weren't willing to pay for the service. He pivoted again, this time targeting organizations and companies that needed to contact voters for political campaigns. This customer segment pivot changed who he was selling to, from individual consumers to businesses. Even this pivot faced challenges, but it ultimately led to a successful business. Ries uses Vodafone's journey to show how important it is to keep testing and learning. Each pivot was a chance to gather more information and refine the business model. He introduces the idea of a startup's runway, which is how much time they have left before they run out of money. Ries argues that runway isn't just about how much cash you have, but how many pivots you can still make. The faster you can test and learn, the more chances you have to find a winning strategy. Ries acknowledges that making the decision to pivot is hard. People often get attached to their ideas and are afraid to admit they're wrong. He suggests scheduling regular, pivot or persevere, meetings to discuss the data and make a clear-headed decision. He warns against relying on vanity metrics, numbers that look good, but don't actually tell you if your business is working. He also stresses the importance of having clear goals and being willing to fail. He shares the story of Path, a social network that faced criticism for limiting the number of connections users could have. Despite the negative press, the founders listened to their customers, who loved the more intimate experience. This courage to ignore the critics and focus on customer feedback ultimately led to success. Ries concludes by emphasizing that a pivot is a strategic hypothesis, not just a random change. It's about using what you've learned to test a new path forward. He reminds entrepreneurs that pivoting is a normal part of building a successful startup, and that the ability to adapt is key to long-term survival. Chapter 9, Batch. Eric Ries begins this section by sharing a simple story about stuffing envelopes with his daughters, highlighting a surprising truth about efficiency. It seems counterintuitive, but doing one task at a time, completing each envelope fully before starting the next, is actually faster than working in large batches, like folding all the newsletters first and then addressing them. This seemingly small observation is a core idea in lean manufacturing, called single-piece flow. The author explains that batch size refers to how much work moves from one step to the next. A batch of one means doing things one at a time. Ries argues that our brains often trick us into thinking bigger batches are better, because we assume repeating the same task will make us faster. However, this isn't always true. Working with large batches creates extra work, sorting, stacking, and moving piles of unfinished items. He uses the envelope example to illustrate this. If letters don't fit in the envelopes, you only find out at the very end with a large batch, causing a lot of rework. With small batches, problems are spotted immediately. This principle applies to all kinds of work, not just physical tasks. The author traces the origins of this small batch idea to post-World War II Japan. American car factories were focused on mass production, building huge machines to make parts quickly and cheaply. But Japanese companies like Toyota faced different challenges. They had a smaller market and less money for expensive equipment. Instead of trying to compete directly, Toyota innovated by using smaller, more flexible machines and focusing on reducing the time it takes to switch between making different parts. This changeover time became crucial. Ries introduces Shija Shingo and his concept of SMED, single-minute exchange of die, which dramatically reduced the time needed to reconfigure machines. This allowed Toyota to produce a wider variety of cars, catering to different customer needs, and ultimately become the world's largest automaker. The key takeaway is that smaller batches allow for faster problem-solving and greater flexibility. Toyota also implemented the Anden cord, a a system where any worker can stop the production line if they spot a problem. While it might seem disruptive, it's more efficient to fix issues immediately than to let them continue and create more waste. Ries then connects these manufacturing principles to the world of startups. He explains that the goal isn't just to build things efficiently, but to learn how to build a sustainable business as quickly as possible. Just like with the envelopes, finding out early if your product isn't what customers want is much better than finding out later after wasting time and money. He uses the example of IMVU, a company he worked with, to demonstrate how applying these principles can speed up the learning process. Traditionally, software companies release new versions of their products on a monthly, quarterly, or even yearly schedule. Ries argues this is like the large batch approach. IMVU, however, started releasing changes multiple times a day, testing them with a small group of users and immediately getting feedback. This continuous deployment allowed them to learn and adapt much faster. He compares this to a product's immune system, with automated tests and monitoring systems that prevent major problems from reaching customers. Ries acknowledges that not all industries can easily adopt this approach, but he points to 3 trends making it more possible. Hardware becoming more software-driven, faster production changes, thanks to lean manufacturing, and the rise of 3D printing and rapid prototyping. The core idea is to reduce batch size to accelerate the build-measure-learn feedback loop. To illustrate this, Ries shares the story of SGW DesignWorks, a company that helped a client build a complex X-ray system for the military. Instead of a long, drawn-out development process, SGW used 3D modeling and CNC machining to create prototypes quickly, get feedback, and iterate rapidly. They delivered a working product in just 3.5 weeks. The author also touches on how these principles can be applied to education, citing School of One as an example of a system that personalizes learning and allows teachers to experiment with new approaches in small batches. He warns against the large batch death spiral, where companies get stuck in a cycle of building bigger and bigger features without releasing anything, fearing failure. He explains that this happens because people believe working in large batches is more efficient, even when it's causing delays and problems. Ries concludes by emphasizing that the key to success isn't just about adopting lean techniques, but about building a learning organization that prioritizes experimentation and continuous improvement. He highlights the importance of pull, letting customer needs and experiments drive development, rather than pushing features onto the market. He uses Alphabet Energy as an example of a startup that successfully used this approach, pivoting multiple times based on customer feedback and keeping costs low by leveraging existing infrastructure. Ultimately, Ries argues that the ability to learn faster than competitors is the essential competitive advantage for any startup. Chapter 10, Grow. Eric Ries begins this part of his book by sharing a story about 2 very different startups who came to him with the same problem. They weren't growing, despite early success. One startup was building a marketplace for collectors of toys and comics, while the other was creating advanced database software for big companies. It seems strange that these businesses would have the same issue, but Ries explains that they were both stuck because they didn't understand how growth really happens in a startup. He emphasizes that simply having early customers and some money isn't enough. Sustainable growth isn't about one-time boosts like ads or events. It's about customers bringing in more customers. Ries introduces the idea of an engine of growth, which is the system a startup uses to keep growing steadily. He explains that this engine relies on new customers coming from the actions of existing customers. He gives 4 main ways this can happen. First, there's word of mouth, when happy customers tell their friends. Think about how excited someone might be after finding a great new video game and telling everyone they know about it. Second, a product can grow simply by being used, like a fashionable item everyone wants to have. Seeing someone with a cool new phone can make you want one too. Third, companies can use advertising, but only if the money they make from a new customer is more than the cost of getting that customer. Finally, some products are designed to be bought again and again, like groceries or a streaming service subscription. Rise stresses that understanding these engines is crucial because startups often waste time arguing about what to focus on: advertising, product improvements, or pricing. He argues that focusing on the right things is key, and the engine of growth framework helps with that. He uses an analogy of a car engine, explaining that the faster the loop turns, the faster the company grows. Each engine has specific measurements that show how quickly a company can grow. He then dives into 3 specific types of growth engines. The first, the sticky engine, is about keeping customers for a long time. Both of the startups he mentioned earlier were using this engine. The collectible marketplace wanted to become the go-to place for collectors, so they'd keep coming back. The database company knew that once a big company built its systems using their software, it would be very difficult to switch to a competitor. This is like a cell phone company. Once you're a customer, you're likely to stay with them. Rise explains that with this engine, the most important thing to track is the churn rate, or how many customers leave over a period of time. If you get more new customers than you lose, you're growing. He shares how one of the startups he advised realized their churn rate was almost canceling out their new customer rate, meaning they weren't really growing at all. They needed to focus on keeping existing customers happy. Next, Rise describes the viral engine, where customers spread the word about a product automatically. He uses Hotmail as a classic example. They added a simple line to every email saying, "Get your free email at Hotmail," turning every email into an advertisement. This caused rapid growth. He contrasts this with Tupperware parties, where customers actively sell to their friends. The key to this engine is the viral coefficient, how many new customers each existing customer brings in. If that number is greater than 1, the product will grow quickly. He points out that viral products often don't charge directly, relying instead on advertising revenue, because making it easy to sign up is more important than making money right away. Finally, Rise explains the paid engine, where growth is fueled by advertising or sales efforts. He illustrates this with an example of 2 companies, one making a small profit per customer and the other a large profit. Both will grow at the same rate if the cost of acquiring a new customer is the same percentage of revenue for both. This engine relies on making sure the money earned from a customer is greater than the cost of getting them. He uses the example of IMVU, a company he worked with, to show how important it is to find customers that competitors aren't targeting. Rise cautions that startups often try to do too much at once, focusing on all 3 engines instead of specializing. He suggests focusing on one engine at a time. He then connects the idea of engines of growth to product market fit, a term coined by Mark Andreessen. Rise argues that having a clear understanding of your growth engine helps you determine if you've truly found a market that loves your product. It's not just about having a lot of customers, it's about having a system that keeps bringing in more. He emphasizes that tracking the right metrics and constantly improving your engine is key to achieving sustainable growth. Rise concludes by warning that every engine of growth eventually runs out of steam. What works at first won't work forever. Successful companies need to constantly be looking for new engines of growth, even while they're optimizing their current one. He suggests that larger companies need to foster a culture of innovation to ensure they can adapt and continue growing. Chapter 11, Adapt. Eric Ries begins by sharing his experiences as a CTO, admitting even skilled leaders sometimes realize they're failing, and often without any warning. He paints a picture of a shifting job description. You're suddenly tasked with succeeding in a role that didn't exist before, and you've already been failing at it for months. This illustrates a core challenge for growing startups. What works at the beginning doesn't work forever. Rise emphasizes that simply having some process isn't enough. Too little can lead to chaos, but too much can stifle innovation. He's seen companies fail from both extremes, either by being too slow to release anything due to overplanning, or by crashing and burning from a major technical failure right when things were taking off. The author argues against the common split the difference approach to planning, where managers try to find a middle ground between opposing ideas. He explains this can actually make things worse. If everyone knows the boss will average out extreme positions, people will just state the most extreme views possible, leading to endless arguments and ultimately ineffective decisions. Instead, Ries proposes building an adaptive organization, one that constantly adjusts its processes to fit the current situation. He uses the example of IMVU, where they unexpectedly ended up creating a robust employee training program, not because they initially planned to, but because it evolved organically from their need to improve their own processes. Ries stresses that speed is important for startups, but not at the expense of quality. He introduces the concept of speed regulators, like the Anden cord used in Toyota factories. This cord allows anyone to stop the production line if they spot a problem. It seems counterintuitive stopping production to prevent stopping production, but it highlights the idea that fixing quality issues early saves time in the long run. Defects lead to rework, unhappy customers, and ultimately slower progress. This applies to software and services just as much as physical products. A poorly designed or buggy product won't get useful feedback, hindering learning. To illustrate how to build this adaptability, Ries introduces the 5 whys technique. This is a simple but powerful method for getting to the root cause of problems. It involves repeatedly asking why 5 times to dig deeper than surface-level issues. He uses an example from Toyota, showing how a machine breakdown ultimately traced back to a missing strainer. The author emphasizes that the root cause is often a human problem, not a technical one. He then applies the 5 whys to a scenario at IMVU, demonstrating how a technical issue with a new product release ultimately revealed a problem with the company's training practices. Ries explains that the 5 whys should lead to proportional investments. Don't overhaul your entire system for a minor issue. Instead, make small changes at each level of the problem. He uses the training example again, suggesting starting with just an hour of training instead of a full-blown program. This allows for incremental improvement and avoids wasting resources on solutions that aren't needed. The 5 whys acts as a natural speed regulator. The more problems you have, the more you invest in solutions, which then allows you to speed up again. The author cautions against falling into the 5 blames trap, where the technique is used to point fingers instead of finding solutions. He recommends including everyone affected by the problem in the discussion and emphasizing that mistakes are usually caused by flawed systems, not bad people. He suggests a mantra: if a mistake happens, shame on us for making it so easy to make that mistake. He shares a story from IMVU where they intentionally made it easy for new engineers to break the production system, so they could learn from their mistakes and improve the system. Ries provides practical advice for getting started with the 5 whys, including starting small, being specific, and appointing a 5 whys master to facilitate the process. He stresses the importance of executive support and warns that the process can be uncomfortable, as it often reveals unpleasant truths about the organization. Finally, Ries shares a case study of how Intuit, the company behind QuickBooks, used these principles to transform its product development process. Initially, they struggled to implement the changes, but by focusing on smaller batches, faster feedback, and investing in the right technology, they were able to significantly improve customer satisfaction and product quality. The author concludes that building an adaptive organization is an ongoing process, requiring a constant balance between operational excellence and disruptive innovation. It's not about reaching a final state, but about continuously learning and adapting to a changing world. Chapter 12, Innovate. Eric Ries begins by challenging the common belief that companies lose their ability to innovate as they grow bigger. He argues that it's possible for companies to balance taking care of current customers while also finding new ones and exploring new ideas, all at the same time. He believes even large companies can change how they manage things to become more innovative, a concept he calls portfolio thinking. To make innovation happen, Ries explains that teams need the right structure. Startups naturally have this structure because they're small and independent. But inside bigger companies, teams trying new things need support from leaders to create a similar environment. Ries identifies 3 key things these teams need: enough money to work with, but not too much; the freedom to make decisions without getting stuck in endless approvals; and a real reason to care about the outcome, like owning a piece of the project. He stresses that having the right structure is just the first step, but getting it wrong can almost guarantee failure. Ries dives into the first requirement: resources. He points out that leaders in big companies often try to get as much money as possible for their projects, expecting budgets might get cut. But startups are different. Too much money can be just as bad as too little. He uses the example of the dot-com bubble, where many companies failed because they spent too freely. Startups need just enough money to survive, but that money must be secure. It's a tricky balance, but it forces them to be careful and resourceful. Next, Ries talks about giving teams independence. Startup teams need to be able to experiment and build things quickly, without needing approval from many different people. He recommends creating teams with people from all the different parts of the company: engineering, marketing, sales, and so on, working together full-time. This way, they can build and test real products, not just ideas on paper. He acknowledges that giving teams this much freedom can worry leaders, but he promises to explain how to address those concerns later. The third key ingredient, according to Ries, is giving people a personal stake in the outcome. In a startup, this often comes through stock options, meaning employees get a share of the company's success. But even in organizations where money isn't the main goal, like nonprofits, it's important to make sure people feel ownership of their work. Recognizing and celebrating the innovators is crucial. He shares the example of Toyota, where the chief engineer is completely responsible for a new vehicle, from start to finish, fostering a strong sense of ownership. He contrasts this with a high-profile tech company that gives out awards, but without clear rules, leaving teams unmotivated to take risks. Ries then shifts to creating a system for experimentation. He emphasizes the importance of setting ground rules for how these independent teams operate, protecting the main company, holding teams accountable, and bringing successful innovations back into the larger organization. He recalls the success of the SnapTax team at Intuit, which was given freedom to operate like a startup within the larger company, as a good example. He argues that the traditional approach of protecting the startup from the parent company is wrong. Instead, companies should focus on protecting the parent company from the startup. He illustrates this with a story about a company struggling to interpret data from a pricing experiment. Different departments argued over the meaning of the data, leading to no clear decisions. This highlighted problems like using unimportant data, taking too long to run experiments, and a lack of clear goals. Ries explains that this kind of conflict arises from a rational fear of change. Companies often have different customer groups, and changes that benefit one group might harm another. He uses the example of a company with both business customers and individual consumers, where lowering prices for consumers could upset business clients. He stresses that managers will naturally defend their areas of responsibility when they feel threatened. He warns against hiding innovation teams, as this can create distrust and political maneuvering. Instead, he proposes creating an innovation sandbox, a safe space where teams can experiment without disrupting the core business. This sandbox has rules. Experiments must be limited in scope and duration, and results must be measured using clear, consistent metrics. He explains that starting small and gradually expanding the sandbox allows teams to build confidence and learn quickly. Ries emphasizes the importance of accountability. Teams should be held to the same standards as startups, using the build, measure, learn cycle to test their ideas and track their progress. He explains that as an innovation succeeds, it needs to be integrated back into the larger company, with the original innovators potentially moving on to new projects. Finally, Ries discusses how companies need to manage different types of work. Creating new things, growing existing products, optimizing established businesses, and managing legacy systems. He argues that companies should allow people to specialize in the type of work they enjoy and are good at, and that entrepreneur should be a recognized job title within the organization. He concludes by emphasizing the importance of continuous learning and adapting to change, and encourages readers to join a community of practice to share ideas and support each other. And that brings us to the end of our summary of this book. I hope you found it insightful and valuable. If you enjoyed this video, hit like and subscribe for more. Your support helps us bring you more great content. Thanks for watching.